thought that that's what we would focus on for today. Another one of my experts that I've been studying under, you know, some people might say, oh, you have to hit all these checklists of things to have perfect gait. And the reality is you have to have gait that works well for you. It's not necessarily that it has to look perfect. It has to be effective for you. So the elements that I'm going to discuss today are going to be the simplest things that are going to make the biggest difference and that are really usable to do. Gait is like learning how to talk differently. It's not easy to make a really big change. So these little things are going to make a big change for you if you apply them correctly. It's sort of like now that everyone has masks and you wonder if you're going to recognize someone. I am recognizing almost everyone, either by their eyes or by their posture and how they walk. It is amazing how often in the grocery store I'm recognizing someone and I'm not seeing most of their face. So gait is the same way. And gait is also funny because once you're educated in something, you see certain things in people all the time that you might not recognize at first. And you guys will start to see these when I point these out. But as I'm driving and I'm seeing people walking or running on the bike path, there's very specific things that I'm seeing with them that are interesting. So the things I'm going to talk about today, and then I'll go into a posture routine that can be good for walking, is one, we're going to talk about feeling the ground. Two, we're going to talk about being upright, specifically in your upper body. And then three, it's going to be taking the right stride length, which is a specific question that a bunch of people had sort of asked me. So all of these things, elements of them have been in different classes that I've done for the library. And I sometimes forget which one was which. So I'm actually going to go over all of them. So with feeling the ground, the nerves in the bottom of your feet are your peripheral nerves. Those are the ones that send a message to your brain about where you are in space. Things that can affect your peripheral nerves positively would be the toe exercises that we gave. The specific ones that are like wiggling your toes, spreading the toes apart. It was also where the tactile stimulation came in. So potentially, I don't know if you can see it, but the bumpy mat, you know, the bumpy mat was going to stimulate the little nerve endings a little bit better. But essentially, how the peripheral nerves work is they tell your body where you are in space, and then it sends a message to your brain, and your brain says, whoa, I need to make these corrections. So improving, you know, working with potentially an insole that gives you a little bit more tactile stimulation if you have trouble feeling it could be helpful. Having a toe box that is wide enough for your toes. You know, if your toes are wedged into a shoe like this, you're not going to have as good feedback to your brain. Feet should generally be facing forwards, and you can work on preparing for gait by working on the short foot that we had talked about. And when I go over to the mat, I can show you what short foot was again. But short foot is essentially that element where the toes press down and you create a bit of that arch in the foot. In gait, there is an element where your toes lift up entirely and your toes press down entirely. The pressing down is where short foot comes in. We also want the ability to be able to lift up on our toes. And so therefore, an additional thing with walking is that flip-flops don't give you the ability to really lift up your toes. If you had a shoe that was even really, really open, but around the ankle it had a strap or something, then you don't have to grip with your toes. But in a flip-flop or a clog, you're going to be gripping with your toes like this all the time, and you're never going to have the ability to really lift up your toes very much. So there is an element where toes get lifted and toes get pressed down, and it can be helpful to practice that before you're going for a walk. So being upright. Feeling the ground is incredibly important. If you watch a lot of people, they will actually look at the ground when they're walking, okay? And let me show you an example, okay? But a lot of times people will, I have my dog with me, so he might, but so a lot of people are gonna look at the ground. Let's see. I'm gonna have trouble showing what I mean, so I'm gonna talk about it. A lot of people will look at the ground about 3 or 4 feet in front of them, and they're gonna hinge at the hips to do it. So they're gonna hinge at the hips a little bit like, instead of being upright like this, they're gonna hinge at the hips and they're gonna look at the ground about 3 or 4 feet in front of them. Now our eyes are looking at the ground, and what tends to happen is eyes, which are very highly neurological, is our body follows our eyes. And so to a certain extent, people are more likely to fall if you're looking at the ground because of both gravity and because our eyes are precursors to our movements. Now, many people look at the ground because they can't feel the ground properly. So it is always important to balance how well can you feel the ground with where our eyes are in space. But a very good option, okay, is instead of turning your whole head to look down at the ground, okay, is to keep our eyes relatively horizontal in space and put our eyes down to look at the ground. And I know in one of the classes, I can't remember which, I talked about working with the eyes to be able to look down at your devices instead of putting your whole head down and then having, you know, gravity going us forward, okay? So you always want to balance relatively an upright body, your eyes relatively horizontal in space, looking down to the ground as much as necessary to keep you safe, but thinking about whether you can roll your eyes down to look at it or how much you need to bring your neck down to do so. Additionally, so what that might look like is on very, very uneven ground, I am going to look down to have, you know, enough support. But in other areas where I know I'm feeling the ground okay and it's a relatively stable area, I'm going to keep my eyes relatively horizontal and just roll my eyes down to look at the ground to make sure things are safe. And then I'm going to roll my head back upright. Another area, so when people look at the ground, they tend to hinge at the hips and they're going to walk from using their hip flexors. So a lot of people, instead of walking, being upright like this, hinge at their hips, okay? They're going to put strain on their low back and they're going to be walking using their hip flexors. And we ideally want to walk using our glutes. And when I talk about the half foam roller, it's going to allow us to have the proper stride length, which is going to keep us upright, which is going to let us use our glutes as opposed to our hip flexors. But being upright is also about that tight upper back. That tight upper back that is in a C all the time when we're on computers and we're all like this. And something that can be very, very helpful for people is using either a walking stick of some type or to swing your arms and just be upright. So any of the exercises that we're training us to use our upper back and stimulate our upper back better would be helpful, but sometimes walking sticks can too. And I lent out most of my walking sticks, but let me see if these would be helpful. So walking sticks, okay, are for the most part better for people than So this is like a walking stick. And in the ideal world, right, a walking stick is going to be where our elbow is about horizontal, okay? And what that's going to do is instead of leaning over like this, it's not about leaning, it's more about stimulating your body to be more upright. And it can be very, very helpful to people as they get older and they're wanting to feel a little bit more supported. Whereas a cane, as people are leaning forward and they're leaning on things, to be more upright is much, much better for your body. So different elements that are going to specifically, it's not just about hyperextending the back over these rounded shoulders. So people might correct their upper body by, you know, their upper body is over like this, and now I'm going to hyperextend my back, so now I look more upright. It's more about getting my back to be correct, as opposed to just hyperextending my back. So being more upright with your eyes as much as safe, being able to be horizontal in space, not leaning forward, but being upright over our ankles is going to be very helpful with gait. And then taking the proper stride length. And this is probably one of the most important ones. And Katie Bowman's half foam roller, which I have a little link in there. In the link, it talks about stretching, but it doesn't really talk about how to know what your stride length is. So I'm going to go over that a little bit. But a lot of people have been coming back from the doctor, from the podiatrist, saying that their foot issues were coming from, in part, you know, loading the wrong part. So instead of we're supposed to load through our ankles. And if we're not loading through our ankles, we're loading through our midfoot or our forefoot. And those are not meant to be weight bearing. Our ankle is meant to be weight bearing. So this is how you tell what your stride length is supposed to be. So now I will show you. The doctors aren't telling people how to find your stride length. This is both a test of what your stride is, and it is an exercise that's going to help you increase your stride length. And a lot of people like to walk fast. And what I recommend is for you to find out what your stride length is and walk fast, but walk fast by keeping the correct stride length. And then as you lengthen it over time, you can increase your length of your stride, and then you can get some more. So the half foam roller is, let me move this. So here is my half foam roller, okay? There is a stretch where my knee is bent, and this is going to get my soleus. And then there is a stretch where my leg is relatively straight, and that's going to get my gastrocnemius, which is what most people consider a calf muscle, but there can be both. Now my stride is going to be tested on this guy, okay? And I haven't even tested it today. I would guess I'm pretty tight, okay? So I want to load through my ankle with my center of gravity, my pelvis, through my ankle. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to see how far forward, okay, I can bring my other foot while keeping my center of gravity over my ankle. Now, I am bouncing a little bit. Can you see it on my toes? So I'm not even quite owning this, but if I stop and I breathe, I can pretty much own this right here. You can see this is not a really, really, really big step forward. This is only like a couple of inches, right? So this is really what my stride should be. So I should be a pretty narrow stride. Now, if I went forward a lot, okay, I'm bouncing more. And actually, as I'm stretching, I'm able to go more forward and it's not too bad. But if I start bouncing a little bit, or watch what happens when I hinge at the hips. When I hinge at my hips, I can bring this foot way forward. And that is because it's part of that hinged at hips, which falsely increases my back length. So This half foam roller is a great calf stretch before walking, but it's also going to tell you where you should keep your stride length for the day. And then once you really know it, it's a good way to test it, but you could just stretch both at the same time and it would totally work. Any questions so far before I get into some general exercises that can be helpful before a walk? Yes.
It sounds like your stride length is variable by day, by time of day, by strength.
It is, but in general, it's most likely going to be shorter than you think. And then with practice, it's going to get longer than you think, you know? So even for myself, and I know this stuff, I sat a lot during the, pandemic. I was sort of in a funk and I was studying and the weather was bad. And I was better today than I was a couple weeks ago, and I haven't been practicing it. So it can change from day to day, but the reality is it's most likely not going to. It's most likely going to start at shorter than you think and increasing over time. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, so this was part of the Egoscue exercises I'm going to go over were part of a routine that Pete Egoscue had come up with for a warm-up for a walk. And you can find it, I put the links to the individual exercises in, but you can find any of them easily just through the link. But the supine foot circles point flexes really get every single muscle in the lower leg, which is really great. So whereas the calf stretch is a stretch, the supine foot circles point flexes are an exercise to stabilize the lower leg. The assisted hip lift, if someone had or the hip crossover stretch. So assisted hip lift is great for most people. If you had a hip issue like a hip replacement, you may not want to do the hip lift. It would probably be okay. The hip crossover stretch would probably be too much. Yeah, you don't want to do the IT band stretches, but the assisted hip lift would probably be okay. And then the cat and dog would be good for everyone. So I'm going to go over what those look like right now. All right, so this could be done in different ways, okay? I'm going to do it on the ground, but you can also do it sitting, which I'll show you in a second. So my left leg is going to be just active. I'm not letting it sort of slump around. I'm going to hold this guy up. And I'm not moving at my hip, I'm not moving at my knee, and I'm not moving at my ankle other than moving. So I'm going to make circles in one direction. Then I'm going to make circles in the other direction. And then I'm going to point and flex. Most people will have some area where they're like a broken record. It's not nice and smooth. It's like clunk, 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 clunk. And for the most part, that's where you're going to have your issue and where you may want to focus. But there's been 2 clients in my entire posture career who have found this to be not fatiguing. And I'm including a professional athlete. So this is a very good exercise. The assisted hip lift. The nice thing is we have one foot up against the wall, sort of at a 90-degree angle, but you need to be able to have your hips on the ground. So if to have this 90-degree angle, my hip was kind of up from the ground, then I'd want to scoot back so that my both hips were sitting on the ground, one leg was up on the wall. Now I'm going to bring the other leg over, and I'm just going to open up this hip. And I want both hips to be able to be on the ground, and I'm working to kind of open up this hip right here. And then I'm going to alternate. And a lot of people will do this for a minute. This exercise actually is one of the very best ones that open up anterior hip. A lot of my clients really like this. And ironically, doing it up on a wall, you can also scoot down and just do it on the ground, but it doesn't seem to work quite as well for my clients as up on a wall for whatever reason. And then hip crossover stretch. So now we're going to add to it. My arms are going to be at the side. I'm going to have this right here, and I'm going to allow this leg to come here. Okay, I'm going to look at the other direction. This knee is going to try to open up, and I'm going to look in the other direction. I'm going to hold this for a minute. Then I'm going to come back to center. I'm going to let this leg drop. And ooh, I'm tighter this way today. All right. And then because I've worked both sides of the body, but differently, I'm going to come in with cat and dog. So with cat and dog, it is the same as like cat and camel, but I'm going to flex and extend my whole spine. I'm going to start with the pelvis. So I'm going to have my pelvis go, and then I'm going to look up, and then I'm going to have my pelvis drive the other way. So now I'm going to just sort of get my back moving. Okay. Now, how you could do it even sitting, okay, is if you were sitting and you didn't want to get all the way to the ground, okay, you can almost, this is actually a little low for me. If I was higher, I could have an element where my hip was open, okay, so I'm almost doing like the assisted hip lift right here, and then I can do my foot circles and point flexes at the same time. And then I could almost do my back exercises at the same time. And I could practice twisting as well, which this exercise I had in the sitting one. So I showed it to you if it was on the ground, but also how you could do it if getting to the ground wasn't as easy for you, or if you didn't want to take the time for it. Any questions?
That's what I have always called the figure 4 stretch.
Uh-huh. Yes. Lots of people have different names for them. Egoscue came out with their, their own names for things, but a lot of them are like a yoga pose that has a different name as well. So they tend, the number 4 stretch or the assisted hip lift, they stretch the hip, the deep 6 of the hip.
So the hip crossover stretch, you've got what I would call the figure 4, and then you're rolling toward the floor with the leg that is not crossed over.
You roll towards the not crossed over side. Yeah. Let me show you again. So,
It disappeared.
Okay. So you get the number 4. Okay. Now I'm going to bring my number 4 foot to the ground. So now this ankle is just, this leg is just going to come lie on the ground, the not number 4 one. And then I'm going to actually, if I can, open up this hip more right here. And then I'm going to look in the other direction. So this one gets the hip and the back. If your back is an unhappy back that does not like to twist and rotate, then this is perhaps not the right one for you. Most people can do some element of just the hip. This is sort of what it looks like.
Feels great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Does everyone feel like they understand about Gait? Let me show you really quick a couple more things with Gait. So we've tested out our stride length, okay? So one thing that we want to make sure is that we've relatively, if it's safe to do, we keep our eyes horizontal instead of looking down, okay? But also that we're relatively upright and wading through our ankles as opposed to not hinging at the hips and walking, okay? We want to be upright in our back. We want to be loaded through our ankles. And then we also can, you know, when we go to do our step, we want our toes to come up, and then we want our toes to be able to push down. But mostly that's going to come through the correct exercises of getting into our feet. So, you know, where a lot of people, to get that bigger stride length, because that's going to be better, faster, and more cardio, they're going to hinge at the hips, and then they're going to be able to take a nice long stride. But instead, what we want to do is go faster in the proper stride of that's going to, while increasing it if possible, to have the right stride length for you, so you load through your ankles instead of your midfoot or your forefoot. Guys, got any more questions?
Can you, I don't mean, if somebody else needs a question, go ahead. I've asked many.
Okay.
After you're finished.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
All right. Can you show us short foot again?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Let me bring this here. Can you see my foot? Okay, so short foot is an element. I'm having to bend here, which is not ideal, but so I'm gonna, my toes are up, but now I'm gonna press my toes in the ground. It's all four of them, and this comes up right here. Do you see that?
Yes.
So theoretically, this is short foot, but it's also about the ability to just press the toes into the ground and then lift up the toes is opposite. So press in, lift up, press in. But if you're pressing in correctly, this guy should lift up a little bit too. So that's short foot.
Thank you.
Barb, did you have a question?
A couple comments. When I've been walking, evidently I'm not standing erect because I will get terrible backaches that then goes down into my hip. And I've realized if I stacked or straighter, that doesn't happen. The other thing is that sometimes my shins get really sore.
Mm-hmm.
Have I done something wrong? Am I taking too big of a stride, or am I working muscles that I haven't been working?
Well, so most likely, so if you're looking at it very simply, I hate to say wrong or right because you're walking, right? So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Right.
So, but most likely you're spending more energy having to work very hard to lift your toes up, which is where you get into your shin a little bit more, versus the putting down. And if you're leaning over to help with your back pain, that might be the reason. You're already weighted more on the front, so it is more work to lift up. So that's a tricky thing. So that's a tricky thing, because really what we're aiming for is for you to be able to walk and get exercise. It's nice when you can do it where it's going to be more helpful to your body, you know. There is an exercise called static back that we've had in, you know, our back one. If I could see your body from the side, but just looking at you from the front, okay, I'm going to guess that you have a pretty rounded upper back. And that's one of the reasons why you're already forward. And when you go to get back, it's really hard because you're already so forward, right? So now you're hyper extending your low back, which is probably going to irritate what is already there as far as injury, arthritis, whatever. So one thing that you might want to do to become more upright is to do some passive exercises that are going to reduce that curve, which are going to naturally have you be upright. And I have seen some dramatic work with things like the static back exercises. There was one person that Egoscue had posted, one of the Egoscue clinics had posted a I couldn't believe the befores and afters, and it wasn't one session, but it was the before and after, and I wish I knew what routine they had done to this person, because I never would have thought that someone could make such an improvement. But what they did was, you know, he had a severe kyphosis in his upper back, and they were able to get it down to minimal. And the man was probably, you know, in his 80s, you know, his 80s, 90s. I mean, he was an older man. And as you get older, everything dries up, and it's harder to make a big change. It's easier to make a big change when everything's really fluid. You know, the more things dry up and get stuck together, it's a little harder to make a change. But they made a real dramatic change. And I'm guessing they worked with, so one thing that might help you be more upright is to correct naturally the angle of your back. Because if you're that follows with the, if you're naturally, you know, over like this, and now I'm trying to correct it, I'm going to hyperextend my back, and I'm still kyphotic, but now I'm hyperextended into my back. So what you're going to want to do is naturally get that upper back to be more upright, so you have more space in the back, and then you can be more upright more easily.
Okay. Yeah, I think I have to work on some of these, experiment with them, because right now, and I haven't done very much, but I think I need to get into a routine, and I think I need to be able to gradually
Yes.
get into some different positions.
You do want to. And I know I've mentioned the Dynamic Aging by Katie Bowman, but you would really like that one. It has lots of little, like, slow ease into things, make different changes, makes a big difference. So